Max, the German shepherd, lay on a soft hospital bed. The room was quiet except for the soft beeping of the heart monitor and the sound of Sarah's breathing. It was a peaceful moment, but the sadness in the air was thick, like a cloud that wouldn't go away. Max was old now, and his body had grown weak. His coat, once thick and shiny, was now dull and thin. His once bright eyes were now tired, staring at nothing, as though he knew something his owner couldn't understand. Sarah sat beside him, her hands gently stroking his fur. Her heart was breaking. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Max was more than just a dog to her. He had been with her for so many years, through thick and thin. They had grown up together, sharing so many memories. He had been her protector, her friend, and even her source of comfort when she felt lonely. But now, the time had come to say goodbye. The doctor had told her that Max's illness had reached its end. There was nothing more they could do. The words had hurt, but Sarah had known deep down that the moment was near. Still, she wasn't ready. How could she say goodbye to the dog who had been by her side for so long? Tears slowly slid down her cheeks as she whispered, "I love you, Max." Her voice cracked with emotion. Max didn't respond. He just lay there, breathing slowly, his eyes locked on her face. Sarah wiped her tears away with the back of her hand, trying to hold it together. She wanted to be strong for him, but it was hard. Every time she looked at him, her heart ached even more. Max shifted slightly, his tail twitching just a little. Sarah leaned in closer, hoping for some sign that he was still with her. She needed to know he could hear her, that he could feel her love. She bent down, placing her forehead against his, feeling the warmth of his fur. She closed her eyes, wishing she could stop time and keep him with her forever. But reality was hard to ignore. Max's breathing became slower, more labored. His eyes fluttered shut for a moment before opening again, as if trying to stay awake, trying to hold on just a little longer. Sarah's heart broke even more. How could she say goodbye to him when he was still trying to be there for her? She held his head in her hands, speaking softly, "You can go now, Max. It's okay. You've been so strong for me. I'll be okay. I promise." Her voice was steady now, though her heart was still full of pain. She knew he couldn't live forever. No pet could, but knowing that didn't make it easier. Max's tail gave a tiny, slow wag. Sarah gasped. It was so small, barely a movement, but it felt like the most important thing in the world. It was as if he was saying, "I'm here with you. I love you." It was the last bit of strength he could offer, and it hit Sarah like a wave of emotion. She held him tighter, feeling his warmth, his love, and her own love for him in that moment. For a while, they just sat there in silence, Sarah holding Max as his breathing grew more uneven. The room felt heavy, filled with the weight of goodbye. But in that moment, Max had given her something she would never forget, a final sign of his love. She would carry that moment with her forever. Even in his last moments, Max had found a way to comfort her. And Sarah knew that no matter what happened next, she would always carry him in her heart. Max's body was weak, but his spirit seemed to shine through. Though he had been lying still for what felt like hours, something inside him refused to give up. His tail moved again, just a little. It wasn't much, but for Sarah, it was everything. She wiped her tears away, leaning in closer to him. She had seen this kind of strength before in Max. Even when he was just a puppy, there was a certain fire in his eyes that wouldn't let him quit. And now, even in his old age, that fire was still there. Sarah knew Max was struggling. His breathing was uneven, and every now and then, his chest would rise in a painful way. But still, he fought to stay awake. He fought to stay present for her. In a way, it was as if he knew that she needed him, just one more time. She needed to feel his presence, to know that he was okay, even as he was slipping away. She whispered softly to him, "It's okay, Max. You don't have to stay for me. I want you to be at peace." Max's eyes seemed to focus on her. For a brief moment, it felt as though he truly understood. His head lifted slightly, and he nudged her hand, just as he had done so many times before when he wanted her attention. His fur was softer now, and his once strong frame felt frail in her arms. But the warmth of his love still reached her. She gave a soft laugh, choking on her tears. "You're still trying to take care of me, aren't you?" She stroked his head gently, feeling the soft fur beneath her fingers. He may have been old, and his body may have been failing him, but his heart had always been full of love, and that love had never left. Max had always been protective of her. He had been there for her when she felt down, when the world seemed too hard to face. From the first day she brought him home, a tiny puppy with big ears and a playful bark, they had shared a bond. He had followed her everywhere, whether it was to the grocery store or just around the house. They had become a team, a pair that understood each other without words. Max's loyalty had never wavered. No matter what, he was always by her side. The memories flooded back, running through the park, playing fetch, sitting on the couch together after a long day, Max resting his head in her lap. She could almost hear the sound of his paws as they ran through the grass, feel the warmth of his body as he lay next to her on the cold nights. The love they shared was so simple, yet so powerful. As the minutes passed, Sarah could see Max's energy fading. His breathing grew even slower, and his eyes seemed to close more often. It was clear he was getting tired, but Sarah couldn't bring herself to let go. Every part of her wanted to keep him with her forever, to hold on to those memories, to keep the love they shared alive. Max shifted slightly, as though he were trying to lift his head one last time. He let out a soft sigh, and for a moment, it felt as though time had stopped. Sarah leaned down close to him, brushing her cheek against his fur, and whispered, "I'll never forget you, Max. You'll always be in my heart." Max gave one last, faint wag of his tail. It was small, almost too small to notice, but Sarah saw it. And in that moment, she knew he was saying goodbye. He had fought to stay with her until the very end, but now it was time for him to rest. Tears welled up in her eyes again, but she smiled through them, knowing that Max would always be a part of her. His loyalty, his love, would live on in her heart, in the memories they had created together. And with that final wag of his tail, Max's breathing slowed one last time. His eyes closed gently, as if falling into a peaceful sleep. Sarah held him close, letting out a soft sob as she whispered, "Goodbye, my sweet boy." Max had given her everything he had, right up to the end. And now, she would carry his memory with her forever. Sarah sat in silence, her hand gently resting on Max's fur. The room felt so still, yet her heart was racing. She couldn't believe he was gone. It felt like a bad dream she couldn't wake up from. Max had been with her for so many years, and now all that was left were the memories. But those memories, as painful as they were also a reminder of how special their bond had been. Max wasn't just a pet. He was family. He had been there for her during the good times and the bad. When Sarah first brought him home, he was just a small, clumsy puppy, unsure of the world around him. But even then, there was something in his eyes that made her feel like they were meant to be together. Sarah smiled softly as she remembered that day. She had gone to the shelter, unsure of what she was looking for. But when she saw Max, just a few months old, with big brown eyes and ears that were too big for his head, something inside her clicked. She knew right away that he was the one. He had come right up to her, wagging his little tail, as if he had been waiting for her. That was the moment their journey together began. From that day on, Max had been by her side through everything. He had been there when she moved into her first apartment, sitting by her side while she unpacked boxes. He had stayed close when she started her first job, always waiting for her by the door when she came home, ready to greet her with his happy bark. Even during the difficult times, when life seemed like it was too much to handle, Max had always been there to offer comfort. He would nuzzle his head against her lap, as if to say, "It's okay, I'm here." Max had been more than just a dog. He had been her best friend. When Sarah felt lonely or sad, Max would always sense it. He would curl up next to her and rest his head on her feet, staying close, offering the kind of comfort only a dog could. His presence had been calming, and it made her feel like everything would be okay. No matter what happened, Max was always there, a constant reminder that she wasn't alone. As Sarah sat in the room, her fingers lightly tracing the outline of Max's paw, she realized that the connection they had shared would never be broken. It was something deeper than just companionship. It was a bond of love that went beyond words. The pain she felt now was a sign of how much she had loved him, how deeply their hearts had been intertwined. She stood up slowly, her legs shaky as she walked to the window. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light across the room. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, imagining Max running through the fields, his coat shining in the sunlight, tail wagging in the breeze. In her heart, she knew he was happy now, free from the pain that had slowed him down in his last days. She could almost see him, running with all the energy he had when he was younger, looking back at her as if to say, "I'm okay." Tears filled her eyes, but this time, they weren't just tears of sadness. They were also tears of gratitude. Sarah had been blessed to have Max in her life. The love they shared was irreplaceable, and she knew that no matter what, she would always carry a piece of him with her. Max had taught her so many things: how to love unconditionally, how to be patient, and how to face each day with a little bit of joy, no matter what came her way. As Sarah walked back to Max's side, she placed her hand gently on his head one last time. "I'll never forget you," she whispered softly. "You'll always be with me, Max. Always." And even though he was no longer physically there, she could feel his presence in her heart. Max had left an indelible mark on her soul, one that would last forever. The days that followed were hard for Sarah. She woke up each morning with a heavy feeling in her chest, as if something was missing. Max's absence was so strong it felt like a part of her was gone. The house was quieter now. There was no soft patting of paws on the floor, no wagging tail to greet her when she walked in the door. It felt empty, and every corner of the house reminded her of him. Sarah tried to keep busy, doing little things around the house to distract herself. She washed the dishes, cleaned the windows, and took long walks to the park where she and Max used to go. But no matter how hard she tried, the emptiness inside her never seemed to go away. One morning, Sarah was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring out the window. The sky was gray, and the wind was blowing through the trees, just like it had when Max had been with her. She closed her eyes, remembering how he used to sit by the window with her, watching the world outside. It had been their quiet moment together. But now, every time she looked at that spot, it reminded her of his absence. She sighed deeply, and tears began to fill her eyes. The pain of losing him was still so fresh. It was hard to accept that Max was really gone. Just then, something unexpected happened. Sarah heard a small noise from the corner of the room. She looked up, expecting to see the empty space where Max used to sleep. But to her surprise, there, lying on the floor, was his favorite blanket. It had been tucked away in the closet, folded neatly since the day he passed away. Sarah didn't know how it had gotten there. At first, she thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But then, as she looked closer, she noticed something even more strange. The blanket was warm. Not just the kind of warmth you get from sitting under it for a while, but a deep, comforting warmth. She stood up slowly and walked over to it, her heart racing with a mix of confusion and wonder. She bent down and touched the fabric, expecting it to be cool. But it wasn't. It was warm, just like it had been when Max had curled up in it. As she touched the blanket, Sarah felt something in her heart shift. She could almost hear Max's soft, steady breathing again, as if he were lying there beside her. It was like he was trying to comfort her, just as he had done so many times before. His love for her had never left, even though he was no longer with her physically. It was like Max had found a way to reach out to her, letting her know that he was still there in spirit. Sarah sank down onto the floor next to the blanket, tears streaming down her face once more. But these weren't just tears of sadness. They were tears of relief. She realized that even though Max was gone, he was still watching over her, still looking out for her. The bond they had shared could never be broken, not by time, not by distance, and certainly not by death. As she sat there, surrounded by the warmth of the blanket, Sarah whispered, "I miss you, Max. I'll always miss you." But she also knew that she would never be truly alone. Max had left a piece of himself with her, and that piece would stay in her heart forever. She could almost hear his gentle bark in her mind, as if he were telling her, "It's okay, I'm still with you." Sarah smiled through her tears. She picked up the blanket, holding it close to her chest, feeling its warmth and comfort. Max's love had never left her. It was always there, in every small sign, in every memory, in every moment when she needed him the most. And as Sarah looked around the room, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. Max had given her so much during his life, and now, even in his passing, he had found a way to remind her that love never truly ends. Weeks passed after Max's passing, and Sarah still couldn't get used to the silence in the house. It felt like a chapter of her life had ended, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't find a way to start a new one without him. Every day the grief seemed to wrap around her, heavy and suffocating. Even when she went to work, she found herself distracted, lost in memories of Max's wagging tail, his playful bark, and his comforting presence. But one evening, as Sarah sat on the couch, she realized something. It was a quiet evening, the kind that felt just like any other. She was sipping a cup of tea, the warmth of the mug in her hands offering a small comfort. The house was peaceful, the only sound coming from the ticking of the clock on the wall. For the first time since Max's death, Sarah didn't feel overwhelmed with sadness. Instead, she felt a quiet connection to him. She wasn't sure how to explain it, but in that moment, it felt as though Max was still with her, watching over her. She could almost feel his presence, like a soft, comforting energy that surrounded her. It was then that Sarah had the thought, "What if Max is still trying to comfort me?" She smiled to herself, as if the idea was somehow reassuring. She got up from the couch and walked over to the little spot by the door where Max's collar still hung. She had kept it there, as a reminder of his loyalty and love. She picked it up in her hands, feeling the cool metal and soft leather, and as she held it, a memory flooded her mind. It was from the days when Max was still healthy, his tail wagging as he bounded through the yard, barking joyfully. She remembered how he would run to her, always so excited to see her after a long day. "Max, you're my best friend," she would tell him, and he would wag his tail as if to say, "I know." She closed her eyes, letting the memory wash over her. And in that moment, she felt something almost magical. It was as if Max's love had never left her. It had simply changed form. His spirit, his soul, still lingered in the house, still wrapped around her heart, offering comfort. For the first time in weeks, Sarah didn't feel alone. She felt like Max was right there beside her, in the air, in the warmth of the room. She took a deep breath, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel peace. The grief was still there, deep down, but it wasn't overwhelming her anymore. Max had shown her that it was okay to move forward, that his love would stay with her forever. She walked over to the window, staring out into the night. The stars were twinkling in the sky, and Sarah thought of how Max used to love sitting by the window, watching the world outside. She could almost imagine him there, looking up at the same sky, happy and free. She smiled softly and whispered, "I'll always love you, Max. You'll always be my best friend." As Sarah turned to leave the room, something unexpected happened. She felt a gentle breeze on her face, even though the window was closed. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, and for a brief moment, it was as if Max had nuzzled his nose against her cheek, just like he used to do when he wanted her attention. It was a small, simple moment, but it filled her heart with a sense of comfort she hadn't felt in a long time. She walked slowly to her bedroom, feeling a sense of calm in her heart. The pain of losing Max wasn't gone, but now she knew that his love would always be with her, in ways she couldn't see, but could always feel. The bond they had shared had not ended with his passing. It had simply changed. Max was still with her in the quiet moments, in the memories, and in the love that would never fade. Sarah smiled to herself as she lay down to sleep, knowing that somehow Max would always be right there beside her. Sarah woke up early the next morning, feeling unusually calm. The sunlight was just beginning to pour into the room, casting soft beams across the floor. She stretched and sat up in bed, a small smile playing on her lips. She had dreamt about Max the night before. In her dream, he had been healthy and happy, running through a meadow, his tail wagging wildly as he looked back at her, waiting for her to catch up. She had reached out to him, and in the dream, he had nuzzled her hand, just like he used to do. When Sarah woke up, she felt a strange sense of peace. She knew that the dream wasn't just a dream. It felt real, as if Max was reaching out to her, letting her know that he was okay. And that feeling stayed with her as she got out of bed and started her morning routine. As she walked into the kitchen to make her coffee, she noticed something strange. On the floor, near the door, was a small toy bone. It was one of Max's favorite toys, a small rubber bone that he would carry around with him everywhere. She hadn't seen it in weeks, not since the day Max had passed away. Sarah knelt down and picked up the toy, holding it in her hands. She couldn't explain it, but she felt like it was a sign, a message from Max. Her heart skipped a beat as she thought about the dream she had just had. It was as though Max had left the toy there, to remind her that he was still watching over her. Tears filled her eyes as she sat down on the couch, holding the small toy in her lap. It was hard to believe that something so simple, a small toy bone, could bring her so much comfort. But in that moment, Sarah understood that it wasn't just the toy. It was the love Max had always shown her. It was his way of saying, "I'm still here." She closed her eyes and held the toy close to her chest, letting the memories flood back. She thought about all the times Max had carried that toy around, his big goofy grin on his face as he wagged his tail. She thought about the way he would nudge the toy toward her, wanting her to play with him, even when she was tired. Max had always known how to make her smile, how to lift her spirits when she was feeling down. For a long time, Sarah just sat there, holding the toy and letting the tears flow. She wasn't sad anymore, not in the way she had been before. Her sadness had changed into something deeper, something more meaningful. Max's love had never truly left her. It was still there, in the memories, in the signs, in the small moments that reminded her of the bond they had shared. As the morning wore on, Sarah felt a quiet sense of peace wash over her. She knew that it would take time for the pain of losing Max to fade completely, but she also knew that he would always be a part of her. He had been her companion, her protector, and her best friend. And no matter what, he would always hold a special place in her heart. She stood up from the couch and walked over to the window, looking out at the yard where Max had loved to play. She smiled softly, imagining him running through the grass, chasing after a ball, his tail wagging with excitement. It was as though she could see him there, in her mind's eye, still enjoying the freedom he had once known. As Sarah looked out into the yard, she whispered, "Thank you, Max, for everything. I will always love you." And as she spoke those words, she felt a small breeze blow through the room. It was gentle, as if Max were right there, giving her one last comforting sign. She closed her eyes, knowing that his love would never fade, no matter how much time passed. Max would always be a part of her life, watching over her from the place beyond, his spirit living on in her heart forever. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah began to feel the weight of the loss lessen, but the ache in her heart was still there. Max had been such an important part of her life, and although she had begun to find moments of peace, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. However, a part of her had also realized something important. Life had to continue. Max wouldn't have wanted her to stay stuck in sadness forever. He had always been about living in the moment and finding joy in the simple things. One morning, Sarah decided to take a walk in the park where she and Max had spent so much time. She hadn't been there since his passing, and the idea of going back seemed both comforting and painful at the same time. She thought it might help her find a sense of closure, or at least remind her of the good memories they had shared there. When Sarah arrived at the park, the air was cool and fresh, and the sun was just beginning to rise. The park was quiet, with only a few people walking their dogs or jogging along the path. As Sarah walked along the familiar trail, she couldn't help but imagine Max walking beside her, his paws hitting the ground softly, his tail wagging with excitement as they explored the same paths they had so many times before. She found the spot by the large oak tree where Max had always loved to sit. It was shaded, and the grass there had always been soft and cool. Sarah sat down under the tree, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face, and closed her eyes for a moment. She let the quiet sounds of the park fill her senses, the rustling of leaves, the distant chirp of birds, and the soft crunch of gravel underfoot. For a long time, she just sat there, breathing in the fresh air, remembering all the happy moments she had shared with Max. She could almost hear his happy bark, see his joyful face as he ran through the park chasing after his favorite ball. The memories flooded back, not as painful reminders, but as precious moments she would always carry with her. After a while, Sarah stood up and started walking again, this time heading toward the small pond where she and Max had once played. The pond was quiet, the surface of the water reflecting the blue sky above. Sarah smiled as she remembered how Max used to love splashing around in the water, chasing after the ducks that sometimes wandered too close. He had always been so full of life, so full of joy. As she stood by the pond, she thought about all the ways Max had made her life better. He had been there for her when she needed him most, offering unconditional love and comfort. He had been her best friend, her confidant, and her protector. And even though he was no longer with her in the way he had been, she knew that he would always be with her in spirit. His love had left a lasting imprint on her heart, one that would never fade. Sarah closed her eyes and whispered softly to the wind, "Thank you, Max. I'll never forget you. You'll always be a part of me." Just then, something unexpected happened. A gentle breeze blew through the trees, rustling the leaves and causing a few to fall gently to the ground. It was as if nature itself was responding to her words, offering her a small sign that Max was still out there, still with her in some way. A smile spread across Sarah's face as she opened her eyes. It was a simple, quiet moment, but it brought her a sense of peace. She knew that Max would always be a part of her, that the love they had shared was something that would never be broken, no matter how much time passed. As Sarah walked back home that afternoon, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. The park, the memories, and the gentle breeze had reminded her that even though Max was gone, his spirit was alive in her heart. She would never forget him, and his love would continue to guide her through the days ahead. And as she looked up at the sky, Sarah smiled, knowing that Max was watching over her, sending his love in the quietest of ways. As the months passed, Sarah continued to heal, though the wound left by Max's passing would never fully close. The grief had become something she had learned to carry, like a quiet companion by her side, always there, but not as overwhelming as it once had been. She had found a new rhythm in life, one that was filled with both the sadness of loss and the joy of remembering the beautiful moments she had shared with Max. One afternoon, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, sipping a cup of tea. The sun was beginning to set, casting warm golden light through the windows. It was a peaceful evening, and as she sat there, she thought about how much her life had changed since Max's passing. She had grown, both in strength and in understanding. She had learned that love does not end with death. It transforms into something that can never be erased, a love that lingers in the heart forever. Sarah had found new ways to honor Max's memory. She volunteered at the animal shelter where she had first found him, helping other dogs find the loving homes they deserved. Every time she saw a dog with big, hopeful eyes, she thought of Max, remembering how he had looked at her the day they met. She knew she was giving back to the animals who needed love, just as Max had needed hers all those years ago. One day, as Sarah walked into the shelter, she spotted a German shepherd in one of the kennels. He looked up at her with eyes that reminded her so much of Max. His coat was a bit more scruffy, his ears a little floppy, but the way he looked at her, it was as if he knew her, as if he was meant to be with her. Sarah walked over to the kennel, her heart skipping a beat. The dog wagged his tail, as if he knew she was there to meet him. Without thinking, Sarah opened the gate and knelt down, allowing the dog to come closer. He sniffed her hand gently, and then nuzzled his head into her lap, just like Max had done so many times. The moment felt surreal, as if Max was there, sending her a sign that it was okay to love again. She smiled through her tears and whispered, "You remind me so much of him." The shelter worker, who had been watching from a distance, came over. "He's been here for a while," she said softly. "He's a sweet boy, but he's had a hard time trusting people. He just needs someone to show him love." Sarah looked down at the dog, feeling a strong connection. She knew, in that moment, that she was meant to take him home. It wasn't about replacing Max. It was about opening her heart to another dog who needed love, just like Max had needed her. After completing the paperwork, Sarah took the German shepherd home. She named him Milo, after Max's middle name, as a way to honor him. Milo quickly became a part of her life, his playful energy and loyalty bringing new joy into her days. And though he would never replace Max, he became a new companion who filled her heart with love in a way she hadn't expected. Every time Milo nuzzled her hand or curled up beside her on the couch, Sarah felt Max's presence, as if he was there, watching over them both. She knew that Max's spirit had guided her to this moment, reminding her that love never truly leaves. It just changes forms. In the quiet moments, when Sarah would sit with Milo and think of Max, she would smile and whisper, "Thank you, Max, for teaching me how to love, and for showing me that even in the hardest times, there's always room for more love." And as she looked out at the stars that night, she felt a deep sense of peace. Max's love would always be with her, guiding her through life. His memory would remain in her heart forever, a love that could never be taken away. She knew that, no matter where life took her, Max would always be there, watching over her, his spirit living on in every step she took, in every moment of love she shared.